19 months. That is how long 5 men survived on one of the most brutal islands on Earth before they built their own way out. No rescue ships on the horizon, no radio cutting through the static, no government operation being organized on their behalf. Just 5 men, a violent coastline, and a decision made fresh every single morning to keep moving instead of lying down. It started the way most catastrophes start, not with one dramatic mistake, but with ambition dressed up as opportunity and a sea that had been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment. On December 12, 1863, a modest trading schooner called the Grafton sat in Sydney Harbor taking on supplies. She was not built for what was coming. Just over 80 tons, 2 masts, the kind of vessel meant for calm coastal routes between safe ports, not for the Southern Ocean, not for the latitudes where wind has been gathering speed for thousands of miles with nothing solid to slow it down. Her captain was Thomas Musgrave, 42 years old, American-born, and shaped by more than 20 decades at sea into something precise and deliberate. He kept detailed logs. He recorded distances and bearings of the way other men said prayers, out of habit, because he understood that attention to small things is what separates the living from the lost. He wrote down observations other men considered unnecessary. Later, those observations would become the difference between history and silence. 4 men sailed with him. François Reynaud was French, 31 years old, trained as a scientist and engineer with genuine expertise in metallurgy and mechanics. Captains on speculative voyages did not usually welcome educated men aboard, because educated men often arrived with theories and left the physical work for everyone else. Musgrave figured out quickly that Reynaud was built differently. He had technical imagination and a work ethic that did not stop until the hands were bleeding and the task was finished. Henry McLaren was 35, Scottish, served as mate. Steady, quiet, constructed for endurance without complaint, exactly the kind of man you want beside you when conditions stop being manageable. George Harris, 25, Portuguese, was physically powerful and skilled at hunting in ways that would prove more valuable than anyone understood at the start. Henry Forrest, Norwegian, 28, was quieter than the others, mechanically inclined, less experienced but genuinely willing to learn, which, in practice, is worth more than experience without that quality. 5 men, small number for a dangerous voyage, but small crews hold together under pressure in ways that large ones simply do not. Fewer fractures, fewer egos pulling in opposite directions when the situation begins demanding unity. The mission was tin. Reports had circulated that the Auckland Islands, remote and storm-hammered and sitting near 50 degrees south latitude, might hold mineral deposits worth the danger of reaching them. Musgrave's backers believed those reports because the sea does something particular to human judgment. Distance from ordinary life creates a loosening of caution, a quiet sense that normal rules of risk apply to other people in other circumstances, but not to this voyage, not to this specific opportunity. They sailed south, and the world changed gradually around them. The air sharpened, the ocean darkened, and took on a different kind of weight. By late December, the Auckland Islands materialized through the mist as a ragged outline of green and black. These islands sit inside the belt sailors called the Furious 50s, where westerly winds circle the entire globe with almost nothing solid interrupting their momentum. In those latitudes, storms are not unusual events. They are the permanent condition. Violence is the baseline, and everything else is a temporary pause between one form of it and the next. As the Grafton moved toward the islands, the wind rose and the sea built fast into something heavier than anything they had been sailing through. Rain came sideways in dense sheets, visibility collapsed. Musgrave pushed toward the southern coast of Auckland Island, looking for a bay that might offer some shelter from the worst of it. He found what would later be called Carnley Harbor. He ordered anchor dropped. The anchor dragged across the bottom and held nothing. Through the night of January 3, 1864, 5 men worked without rest, resetting lines, fighting sails, trying to keep the Grafton off the rocks they could hear grinding in the dark but could not see. They were soaked completely through. Cold had moved past skin and muscle, into bone, and settled there. Near dawn, they heard the sound every sailor carries in the back of their mind as a specific and private dread: the grinding crack of a wooden hull meeting stone. The Grafton shuddered hard. Water started coming in through the hull faster than anything could be done about it. Musgrave made the only rational call remaining to him: abandon ship. Watching a vessel die is a specific kind of disorientation that people who have not experienced it cannot entirely imagine. A ship is not just transportation, it's shelter and toolkit and guarantee against everything the ocean might decide to do. When it breaks apart, your entire world collapses instantly to whatever you grabbed before the sea finished its work, and whatever land exists nearby that will accept your weight. They pulled from the wreck what they could reach before the Grafton came apart completely: the ship's dinghy, a compass, a quadrant, a watch, one gun with limited ammunition, canvas, tools, food grabbed in desperate handfuls from flooded compartments. They dragged it all ashore and stood watching the Grafton shatter against the rocks, timber and rope pulled apart by water that had no opinion whatsoever about whether they survived the night. The Auckland Islands are hostile in a very specific and relentless way. Rain falls for most of the year. Summer is cold by most standards, and winter is genuinely brutal. The wind never completely stops. Dense scrub covers the hillsides and conceals bogs that swallow anyone who steps into them without warning. Cliffs drop straight into a sea that hits the coast with the steady patience of something that knows it will outlast everything placed against it. Ships in the 19th century avoided these islands when the choice existed. Those that did not sometimes vanished entirely. Rescue was not merely an unlikely prospect. It was essentially a story men told themselves, because the alternative meant accepting that no ending was coming except the one the island decided upon. Their first night ashore was spent huddled under canvas, with wind working at every edge and seam like fingers trying to get through. Nobody slept in any meaningful sense. They drifted through exhausted awareness, came back to consciousness, and drifted again, listening to trees bending hard in the dark. At dawn, Musgrave gathered them and spoke without ceremony. The situation was serious, he said. It was not without hope. They could wait passively for rescue and likely die in that waiting, or they could build a life, however rough, and make rescue happen through their own action. That distinction between waiting and building was not a motivational speech, it was a structural truth. Waiting requires nothing from a person, and that emptiness becomes its own slow destruction. Building creates forward motion, and forward motion gives men something real to wake up for. From the very first week, Musgrave imposed routine with the same deliberateness he had applied to everything at sea. He remained captain, but did not lead through humiliation or threat. Decisions were talked through among all five. Work was assigned based on demonstrated skill. They ate together every day without exception. They kept a calendar and marked each passing day with intention. They observed Sundays, not because the island acknowledged any form of religion, but because ritual is the structure that keeps human beings from unraveling when everything external has been stripped away. Cleanliness was maintained. Arguments were permitted and required to reach resolution. Every single one of these choices sounds insignificant in isolation. Together, they functioned like the frame of a building. Remove them, and what remains collapses inward. In extended isolation, small daily habits are not comfort, they are architecture. They explored the bay and found what they needed to stay alive: a freshwater stream, timber in the forest above the shore, seals along the coastline in numbers that changed the entire calculation. The seals were essential, and Reynal understood this immediately, not as a food source, but as a supply depot. They were meat, fat, hide, and sinew.
Harris turned out to be exceptionally capable in the hunt, and the others learned alongside him with the urgency of men who understood that hesitation was something they could not afford. They rendered fat for lamp oil, they smoked meat for long-term storage, they saved every hide with clear purpose. Raynal approached the seal not as a meal, but as raw material waiting to be converted into whatever they needed most at any given moment. Musgrave insisted they build a real structure, not canvas propped against timber, not a temporary arrangement they would improve when they had more time, an actual house capable of surviving the winter that was absolutely coming toward them. Using salvaged tools and sustained effort, they felled trees, hauled logs, split timber, fitted walls, and raised a cabin near their water source. They named it Epicu, a word Musgrave remembered meaning
a refuge, more idea than location. They built a stone fireplace and sleeping platforms inside. By any standard imported from the outside world, it was not comfortable. By the standard of that coastline in that season, dryness was a form of luxury that earned genuine gratitude every single morning it held. Then they built something well beyond bare survival. This is the part that makes the Grafton story stand apart from most accounts that share its general outline. Raynal looked at their situation the way an engineer surveys a problem site. Most castaways reduce. They eat what is available, sleep when possible, survive day by day while watching the horizon for the sail that might or might not appear. The Grafton crew expanded instead. They started manufacturing things from almost nothing, which sounds straightforward until you understand in concrete terms what that actually required. Using stone and clay and a technical understanding of thermodynamics that he carried entirely inside his head, Raynal constructed a working forge on a sub-Antarctic island with no supply chain and no professional equipment. He built bellows from seal skin stretched over a frame with valves fashioned from salvaged metal scraps. The result was not beautiful. It worked. With a working forge came heat. With heat came repair. With repair came the ability to improve systematically. They sharpened tools that had grown dull back to usefulness. They hammered broken metal into entirely new shapes. They forged fasteners when existing ones failed. They built lamps running on seal oil. They produced soap from rendered fat and caustic ash. They tanned hides and stitched them into waterproof garments that could resist the constant wet. When Musgrave needed to maintain his journal, which he did because writing was another method of keeping the mind ordered and intact, they even produced working ink from materials the island provided without asking for anything in return. Winter pressed in, and the island tightened around them. Storms struck the coast with real and sustained force. Rain converted every path to mud that pulled at each step. Afternoon light arrived reluctantly and disappeared early, but inside Epique they held the line they had drawn in the first week. They repaired the roof when it needed it. They maintained the fire and the routine and the habits Musgrave had established from the beginning. Depression arrived in cycles, the way it always does in prolonged confinement. Not exactly sadness, but more like the quiet and gradual draining of meaning from actions that had previously felt purposeful. They responded with deliberate work, with conversation, with shared meals and planned activity. Raynal gave informal lessons in mechanics and basic chemistry. Musgrave read aloud from the small collection of material they had salvaged. They played games improvised from bones and scrap wood. None of this was entertainment in any real sense. It was maintenance, purposeful maintenance of minds that would otherwise turn slowly inward and begin consuming themselves. Months passed. No ship appeared. The idea that was probably been forming quietly in every one of them, the kind of thought that feels almost guilty at first because it accepts that official rescue is not coming, moved gradually from background to the center of everything they planned and built and discussed. They would leave the island under their own power, or they would not leave it at all. They had the dinghy. As it existed, it was adequate for calm harbor water, and essentially nothing beyond that. Reynal proposed transforming it into something capable of crossing open ocean by cutting and extending the hull, rebuilding the keel entirely, adding a small deck for water management, and rigging it with sail and rudder robust enough to survive what the Southern Ocean would put them through. In a proper shipyard with professional tools and trained labor, this would have been a serious and ambitious undertaking. On a sub-Antarctic island with a forge built from stone and clay and stubborn reasoning, it existed somewhere between the genuinely ambitious and the genuinely insane. But impossible is a word that loses every bit of its authority when death is the concrete alternative sitting directly opposite you every single day. They started by building better tools because better tools made everything downstream possible. Metal salvaged from the wreck, fittings and barrel hoops and broken hinges, and anything that could be reformed in the forge became nails and spikes and clamps and cutting edges. Each new tool expanded the range of what the following task could attempt. They moved the dinghy to a clearing near the cabin and began the careful, difficult work of remaking her from the inside out. They extended the hull to roughly 17 feet. They fitted a new keel. They reinforced every stress point with the care of men who understood with complete clarity that their lives would depend on each of those decisions holding under pressure. They caulked seams with a mixture of seal fur, fat, and tree resin worked into the joints until the hull held water properly and consistently. A storm nearly ended the entire project. Floodwater crept under the hull and warped critical sections of wood. 10 months of continuous labor seemed visibly to sag under the weight of what the sea had just done to it. McLaren spoke first, in the flat, practical voice of a sailor who has learned that strong emotion only delays what still needs to be done. They would fix it and continue. They repaired the damage. They improved drainage around the work area. They reinforced the places that had given way, and they kept going. By mid-1865, the boat was nearly ready. They named her Rescue, a name carrying hope and a quiet form of defiance. She had a small deck and a low cabin structure to shed water, a mast with sail cut from salvaged canvas, rigging twisted from sinew and plant fiber treated with fat to resist water damage, ballast added for stability when waves tried to put her over. She was still dangerously small for what they intended to attempt with her. She was real, which was more than she had been when Reynal first sketched the idea in the air with his hands. Capacity was the final and unavoidable problem. Fully loaded with supplies for an ocean crossing, Rescue could not safely carry all 5 men. Someone would stay on the island. The decision was made without drama and without sentiment, settled with the grim practical logic that 19 months on that shore had permanently installed in every one of them. Musgrave would go because navigation required him and because port authorities would listen to a captain. Reynal would go because he understood the boat's construction at a level that could mean the difference between fixing a failure at sea and drowning from one. Forez would go because 3 was the bare minimum needed to work sails, hold the tiller, and bail continuously through sustained heavy weather. McLaren and Harris would remain at Epiquet, maintain the cabin, keep a signal fire laid and ready, and wait for the men that left to send Rescue back, because reaching civilization was the first half of what still needed to happen. On July 19, 1865, after 19 months on Auckland Island, they launched Rescue into Carnley Harbor. The farewell between men who have endured that much together doesn't look the way people who have not been through it tend to imagine. No speeches, a long grip of the hand, a look that contains everything that words would only reduce. Then Musgrave, Reynal, and Forez pushed off, and the boat moved out into the gray water, and the 2 figures standing on shore grew smaller and then disappeared behind the headland entirely. The first day gave them something approaching mercy, manageable seas, wind that let them test the rigging without immediate disaster. They found what worked and adjusted what did not, and ate cold food and took turns at the tiller, and for a stretch of hours the crossing seemed like something that might actually be completed. Then the weather changed.
It always does in the furious 50s. Cloud came down hard, and the wind sharpened, and the ocean started building, swells stacking on top of each other and growing to steep, punishing walls of water. By nightfall, they were inside a full gale. Musgrave held the tiller with everything 2 decades at sea had given him, working angle and timing constantly to keep rescue oriented so the waves struck her where she was built to absorb them, rather than where they would put her over. Reynal and Forez bailed without stopping, hands raw, shoulders burning from the repetitive motion, water coming over the sides faster than the boat could drain it naturally. Sleep came in minutes at a time, brief surrenders to exhaustion interrupted by the next wave or the next shout from whoever was holding the tiller. Then a large wave struck them directly broadside. Rescue went hard over. The mast touched the surface of the water. The sea poured across the deck and into the cabin. For several seconds that stretched well past their actual length, it seemed completely certain the ocean was going to finish in deep water what it started on the rocks 18 months before. The boat came back upright. The seams held. The mast stayed in. They were still alive. Navigation deteriorated steadily as cloud cover made any celestial reading impossible. Dead reckoning, calculating position from known course and estimated speed, was compromised by irregular currents and the simple, unpredictable behavior of a small hull in rough, open water. Musgrave aimed for Stewart Island, the southernmost outpost of New Zealand, roughly 280 miles away. Miss it, and there was open ocean stretching ahead, and colder, more dangerous latitudes falling away behind.
Cold at that level stops being a weather condition and becomes a mechanism that kills from the outside in with patient efficiency. On the 5th day, conditions eased just enough to allow some visibility. A gap opened in the unbroken gray, and Forez, scanning the horizon with the concentrated attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking for, saw something that did not move the way cloud moves. Stewart Island sat low and dark against the slightly lighter sky behind it. Port towns' sympathy is freely available, and real assistance is an entirely different conversation. The Auckland Islands had a reputation that experienced captains took seriously, and it was the middle of winter. No one wanted to risk vessel, crew, and livelihood on a rescue mission into those waters with no guaranteed outcome waiting at the end. There was no formal rescue organization to appeal to. Humanitarian duty existed as a principle and consistently lost its arguments against economics and reasonable self-preservation. Musgrave pushed through every objection placed in front of him. He argued and pressed and made himself impossible to dismiss or defer. 2 men were alive on that island, he told everyone who would hear it, and they had trusted him to return for them, and he was not going to allow that trust to become the final decision they ever placed in another human being. He secured a schooner called the Flying Scud and insisted on serving as pilot himself. Reynal, still regaining his strength from the crossing, contributed precise and detailed descriptions of Carnley Harbour's hazards and safe entry points that only someone who had studied that coastline from the inside for 19 months could provide with any accuracy. In early September 1865, less than 2 months after rescue had touched New Zealand soil, the Flying Scud turned south. When they reached Auckland Island, fog had settled over the entire coastline, and the weather came in hard and low as though the place had one final argument it needed to make. But Musgrave had stared at that shore from too many angles and through too many conditions to be confused by it now. He guided the schooner carefully into Carnley Harbour and around the last headland toward the cove where Epike stood waiting. He raised his glass and looked at the tree line. For a moment, there was nothing at all moving. Then 2 figures emerged from the scrub at the edge of the trees, small against the dark green, running towards the water, waving both arms, alive. Claren and Harris had held the routine for the full 2 months since rescue had left the harbor. They hunted. They maintained the cabin through what the storms brought. They kept the signal fire laid and ready every single day. But hope, operates on a resource that drains steadily when nothing arrives to replenish it. Weeks passed with no sail appearing on the water, no smoke from any direction, no sign that the 3 men who had pushed off from shore were anything other than gone. They did not know whether rescue had made it across or vanished somewhere in the gray. They kept the fire ready anyway, because keeping it ready was the only action that continued to make any sense. When the Flying Scud came around the headland into the bay, what moved through both men standing on the shore was not dramatic in any way visible from the outside. It was entirely physical. A weight that had been sitting on the chest for 2 full months, lifting away all at once.
5 men left Auckland Island together on the same vessel. Before the parting, Musgrave gathered his journal, the tools they had made themselves, and the physical evidence of everything that had been built in that place and how it had been accomplished. The crew of the Flying Scud walked through Epique and stood in silence, looking at what surrounded them on every side. The cabin, the forge, the organized remnants of a small functioning world constructed from wreckage and whatever the island itself could provide in one of the most inhospitable places that exists on this earth. It did not look like desperate improvisation carried out under the pressure of starvation and fear. It looked like something that had been engineered with clear intention and maintained with consistent discipline. Back in civilization, their stories spread the way stories do when they contain something people genuinely want to believe is true about human beings under sustained and terrible pressure. Musgrave published his diary. Raynal wrote his own detailed account with the technical precision of a man who needed the historical record to be fully accurate. The newspapers ran the essential outline: shipwreck, 19 months stranded in the sub-Antarctic, a working forge built from salvaged materials, a rebuilt and extended boat, a crossing of the Southern Ocean in 17 feet of hand-repaired hull, a captain who kept his word and returned for the men he had left behind. What makes this story carry genuine weight beyond the basic fact of survival is not simply that they lived. People survive terrible circumstances through luck alone, and that carries its own kind of meaning. What separates the Grafton crew is the specific mechanism through which they survived. They built structure when structure was entirely optional and maintained it every day after that, even when maintaining it required real effort. They applied technical ingenuity under circumstances that provided almost nothing to work with. And they treated despair not as a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation, but as a problem to be managed with the same practical attention they gave to every other problem. With discipline, with collective effort, with the daily decision made again each morning to keep building when giving up would have been so much easier and so much more forgivable. The Auckland Islands are still there, still cold and wet and completely indifferent to whether any human being finds them survivable. The Southern Ocean still kills, but for 19 months on that remote shore, 5 men built a refuge from wreckage, a workshop from salvage, and a boat from pure determination. Then they drove it into the furious 50s and came out the other side intact. Not through luck, through the decision made again every morning to keep going, when everything around them made stopping seem like the only sensible choice. If this story moved you or shifted something in how you think about what human beings are actually capable of when everything is stripped away, please take a moment to like the video. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you want more true accounts of survival, endurance, and what people do when the world gives them nothing to work with, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thanks for watching.